Hello, welcome to Growing Greener. I'm Ara Anderson, and this is my podcast series for Gardeners' World magazine, where I'm inviting experts to share their knowledge about how we can all become sustainable gardeners. Through a blend of science-based facts, research, experience, and above all passion, you'll discover how your actions in the garden will make a real difference to the planet. A healthy garden starts with healthy soil. So I'm exploring how we can create the best conditions. I'm talking to Professor Duncan Cameron, a world expert in plant and soil biology, who lifts the lid on the mysterious world under our feet. Hi, Duncan. Welcome to Growing Greener.
Oh, thank you. Great to be here.
Well, I'm really glad you're here. And I think it's fair to say that you're not just interested in soil, but you're obsessed with it. And that's really fantastic, because I'm hoping we're going to discover a lot more of its hidden secrets with you today. So I'm going to dive straight in. You say, and I'm going to quote this, "We owe our existence to a 6-inch layer of topsoil and the fact that it rains." Now, tell us a bit more about that statement and what is going on with this unseen world under our feet.
So I pinched that from the Minnesota Farm Growers Association, I think it was, and it was sent to me on Twitter, and I saw it and thought, wow, that really does capture why we can exist at all, because almost all of the food that we eat, pretty much everything, originally comes from our soil. We eat food that might be grown hydroponically, but that's about it. And so the soil really is the foundation of all life on Earth, and absolutely of human civilizations. So we know if civilizations don't look after their soil, that civilizations can collapse because they mistreat their soil. So I think that's quite a big warning to us that something is, something that we call dirt, that we don't really value, is actually the reason that we exist.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important thing, isn't it? Is to really get ourselves focused at, dare I say, ground level, and realise just how precious soil is. It's not just a bit of dirt. So, I think it would be really good to explore and understand what makes up soil, because why is it that people call it dirt and why it isn't dirt? What is it about it, Duncan?
So soil has got some key components. So soil has a lot of air in it. People are quite surprised that there's a huge amount of air in our soil. But our soil is essentially made of 3 key ingredients. It's water, organic material, and minerals. So things like clays or sands, things like that. And in a healthy soil, we've got lots of organic carbon. So carbon that's come from decaying plant material, decaying microbes, things like the exudations, the slime from an earthworm's stomach, for example. All of these things bind together the mineral components of soil, and they create what we call an aggregate. So the soil aggregates are bits of organic matter and bits of mineral matter glued together. And then these little aggregates bind together to make bigger aggregates. And these bigger aggregates are what makes our soil really healthy. We have that lovely crumb structure. When you get down and smell the soil, it smells healthy. And as a soil scientist, we get there, and I don't recommend this, but you can have a chew of the soil. You can work out how gritty it is, how much clay is in there. And it's just a really wonderful environment for life. But when we look at a soil that's been what we call degraded, so not looked after, it's lost a lot of its properties that allow it to function as a healthy ecosystem. That organic component of the soil is often removed. That can happen in lots of different ways. But one of the most common ways is through overworking the land, so ploughing and disturbing the soil. Once you've lost that organic matter, then you've lost a healthy soil, really.
That is very interesting. Obviously, as gardeners, we're not often ploughing as such, but we certainly have got these different ideas about to dig or not to dig. And it sounds to me as if, potentially turning over our soil, which we always used to think was very good for our backs and aerating and getting the worms up and running. But you're kind of saying that maybe that could actually be degrading our soils.
Yeah, it kind of depends on how deep you go, how often you turn over the soil. I mean, if soils start to become compacted, then they lose that aeration, and that means that they set like concrete. I grew up in a house with a clay soil, and despite my mum and dad's best efforts, it would set like concrete in the summer, and you get those familiar cracks all over the growing beds. So they didn't really have a choice. They had to turn over the soil to give it that aeration so we could actually grow stuff. But if you do that regularly or where the soil isn't compacted, you're exposing the carbon that's stored within our soils to the oxygen. And it's a simple bit of chemistry that turns carbon and oxygen into carbon dioxide. And then the organic matter that's gluing the soil together literally just kind of drifts up into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So it's a fine balance. And when we kind of think about movements that have started to arise that really try and take a soil-centric view of, for example, food production, so the conservation agriculture, a regenerative agriculture movement. The regenerative agriculture movement's tagline is really that we work the soil as little as we can possibly work it. Because if the soil's in a healthy state, if it's got lots of carbon in it, it shouldn't really need turning over. Obviously, we use it as a tool to try and get rid of weeds and things, but we can also expose weeds, the seeds of weeds, and they can germinate. We can make the problem worse. So we've got to be really careful that we don't overwork the land. And if it's possible to leave your soil alone, then leave it alone.
Yeah, no, that kind of makes sense because, of course, we talk a lot about putting down mulches onto the soil, to kind of allow that extra organic matter to break down. But I just want to touch a little bit more on carbon because I think sometimes it can be confusing understanding about climate change and carbon in the atmosphere, carbon being kept in the soil. Just why is it so important that carbon remains in the ground?
So there's actually, we think about 5 times more carbon in our soil than there is in the atmosphere. So if all of that carbon became carbon dioxide, we would look at our planet rapidly turning into a planet like Venus with runaway climate change or runaway global warming. So keeping the carbon in the soil is really important, but keeping the carbon in the right place in the soil is really important. So we can have we put on mulches, and that's a really good thing to do. That carbon becomes dissolved and enters the water that percolates through the soil. But that carbon is quite transient. It's not going to stay there for very long. What we need is carbon to be locked into these aggregates. Because once it's locked into these aggregates, it's protected from the action of microbes and of plants. And essentially, if you've got lots of macroaggregates, so getting up towards 0.5 centimetre, the carbon in the middle of those aggregates is essentially stored over geological timescales. If you don't disturb it, it's not going to go anywhere. So yeah, I think it's really important that we think about our soils as potential carbon sinks, because if we manage them properly, they can be part of a tool for reducing the amount of CO2 in our atmosphere and a really powerful tool against global warming.
Oh, that's great, because obviously as gardeners, the soil is so key to what we do, and it's that locking in of the carbon. What as gardeners can we do to ensure that we're keeping it locked in, apart from, like you say, not turning it over so much? What is the mechanism to lock that carbon in?
So it's really encouraging biodiversity. So you want as many worms as possible. You want bacteria that will thrive from them, but also using and encouraging other microbes in the soil, particularly mycorrhizal fungi. So I know you've covered mycorrhizas a few times, but I maybe should explain what they are. So they are this truly ancient symbiosis between plants and fungi in the soil. And essentially what happens is the plant is able to exchange the sugar that it makes through photosynthesis with the fungus, and the fungus goes out into the soil. It uses that energy and it can mine the soil for mineral nutrients, which it gives back to the plant. So it's a huge extension of the plant's root network. But it's also incredibly efficient because the fungal threads, the hyphae, as we call them, are really fine. They can permeate bits of the soil that plant roots just could never get to. And they also have different chemical tricks up their sleeve. So they can use their chemistry in order to remove nutrients from the soil that plants would never be able to remove. So they're a really important part of the soil community, and about 80 to 90% of all plants that live and have ever lived form this symbiosis. And the fact these threads are so tiny, when they die and they turn over in the soil, they are some of the most important agents of sticking these very small aggregates together and creating bigger aggregates where the carbon is more protected.
You see, now that is fascinating to me because, there's so often that our focus is on worms, and worms are great. We know that they eat, they poop, and we love the poop. But I think this other world that's going on, this other ecosystem, and you use the word community there as well. I like to think about, that there's a whole community of things going on underneath our soil. So the mycorrhizae is really important. What other sort of either microbes or insects that are also helping us to keep a healthy soil?
Yeah, so bacteria are really important. There's probably more species of bacteria in a centimetre cubed of soil than there are species of plant on the planet, for example. It's such a biodiverse environment, and some of those bacteria are bad, but some of them are really, really good. And I describe the soil sometimes as an information superhighway. That there are deafening chemical conversations happening between these microbes in the soil. So plants can send out signals into the soil to say, hey, I want this type of bacterium, and I will give you the particular resource that you need to survive. They can do the same to mycorrhiza and say, hey, I'm here, come and colonize me. And then when the mycorrhiza and the bacteria do colonize, they send messages to tell the plant that they're friendly and they're not pathogens. So we have this really deafening conversation. I'm a microbiologist and biological chemist, so my interests are trying to eavesdrop on those chemical conversations, and you find some absolutely fascinating things happening when you kind of peer into that world. And it's only been recently that we've had the technology really to kind of lift the lid on what we've often thought of as the black box in terms of who's in the soil and what are they doing. And now we do understand who's there, or we're starting to at least. We're beginning to understand what they're doing. So I think the word community is really important. And of course, as with every community, you have a bad egg or two, which form the pests and diseases. But if they are the minority in a really diverse community, you can find that by having a healthy soil microbiome, and also having mites and springtails. Some of them are not parasites. They're really good for the soil. Having that complex community means that they can exclude the bad bacteria and the bad fungi, because they just never get a chance to take hold. They get outcompeted by this really diverse community that is, well, I guess, living in harmony.
Yeah, and you have just given a whole new meaning to keeping your ear to the ground, quite literally. You've just given me such an amazing visual of your overhearing these conversations that are happening underneath our feet. But I mean, I think that's great, because it actually, what that's just done is give me that sense, and hopefully our listeners, that the soil is living. It is live. It is a live organism. It's not something that's just there holding our plant roots together. And that's the bit that I guess we've all got to take on board to kind of understand how to look after it even better.
Absolutely, and I think it's, even that quote that we started with, that we owe our entire existence to a 6-inch layer of topsoil, and the fact that it rains, even that really belies the biodiversity of our soils, and how cool they are. When I went to do my PhD, which was in plant and soil biology, my friends, well, I kind of get the plant bit, they're quite boring, but why on earth would you want to study soil? And I'm like, because it's really cool.
Well, it is now. I know that it's actually the reason why I'm here. Absolutely. But I mean, I guess, the pet, you touched on pests and diseases, and I think it would be fair to say that the soil degradation that's, happening not just in the UK, it's happening across the world. It goes a bit beyond, obviously, the gardening fence, if you like, in terms of agriculture and what's going on. But bringing it back to our own backyards, the use of fertilizers and herbicides, glyphosate, that type of thing. Let's talk a bit more about that now that we know that we are talking about a living organism.
So yeah, it's a difficult one, and some of the herbicides we now know have effects on the microbiology of soil, and it's often a trade-off, particularly in agriculture, because herbicides are used to kill off a ley, so a crop, or a non-harvested crop that's planted into the soil to regenerate the soil. So farmers often will have a rotation, and increasingly under regenerative agriculture, they're planting out plants that they're never going to harvest, with clovers and ryegrasses that can rebuild soil structure. And in order to plant in it, one of the techniques that's been used is to spray it off with glyphosate or something like that. And we do know that those kind of chemicals do have an impact on the microbes, and maybe more of an impact than we recognised 10 years ago. But it's all about trade-offs, and in that context, it's, well, the soil is so improved by having one of these lays that it might be worth using a herbicide to spray it off. But I feel really strongly that should be the last resort, not the first resort. And the same at home. We spend a long time every year weeding our gravel driveway, and it would be very tempting to just drench it in glyphosate. But unless I get something sprouting up that I know's got a runner that I'm never going to get, then I do the hand weeding because I know that's a lot better for the soil underneath it. So yeah, I think it's about trade-offs. I don't like extremism in any form, and so I think saying never do something is unhelpful, because there are legitimate times where herbicides, even in the garden, is really important to control troublesome weedy plants. But as I say, it shouldn't be the first resort.
No, I think that is fair. And I think it's really important as well, isn't it, I try never to dictate to somebody. You want to inform people so that they can make an informed choice. I've been in that dilemma myself, with herbicide. You want to get a meadow down as quick as possible, and you're pushed against time. A lot of the time it's, I don't want to wait a year to for the weed. Clients and gardeners, we can be kind of impatient, as well as waiting for plants to grow. We can want to get things cleared up and cleaned up. And I guess that the other side of herbicides, the fertilizers, encouraging those plants to grow, some of the chemical fertilizers, Duncan, what kind of impact do they have on our soils?
Particularly phosphorus, nitrogen fertilizer, potash to some extent. Creating them takes an enormous amount of energy and can cause some really significant environmental damage. So if you take nitrogen, we did a piece of work a few years ago that was quite widely covered in the media when it came out in the journal Nature Plants, looking at the amount of CO2 that's emitted from a loaf of bread. And we showed that in an 800 gram loaf of bread, nearly 700 grams of CO2 are emitted, and shockingly, 40% of those carbon emissions came solely from making the nitrogen fertilizer.
Wow.
So we now know that making nitrogen fertilizer uses a chemical process called the Haber-Bosch process, which makes ammonia. And the Haber-Bosch process consumes 2 to 3% of the global energy budget. So of all of the energy that is generated on the planet in a year, up to even 5% of it is being used to drive a single chemical reaction, which is to make ammonia for fertilizer. And the situation's worse for phosphorus in a way that phosphorus is a finite resource. Most of it sits under Morocco, with bits in Australia and there are bits in North America. So politically, it's very vulnerable. And at the rate we're using it, we think that peak phosphorus, so the maximum amount of phosphorus that we can take out of the land in any year, will occur this century. And essentially, when it's gone, because it's just diluted away into our rivers and then into the sea. And without phosphorus, we have no agriculture, and there's no replacement for it. So I think minimizing our use of phosphorus and nitrogen, and I think using composts, using organic fertilizers. I'm no evangelical fan of the organic movement, but I think it's really important that we use waste as much as we can. And a few years ago, I was on a BBC documentary on Science in Action, saying that we need to think about using human waste much more efficiently. And as unpalatable as that might feel, recovering nutrients from our excrement and generating what we call a circular economy, putting it back on the land, is, I think, really important. And that was the topic of a lecture that I gave to children. So 11-year-old children, I had 1,000 of them come to the University of Sheffield, and it was called Everyone's a Fertilizer Factory. So it was based on that idea.
I'm sure that they were quite entertained, as we know that children are, about that cycle. But yeah, touching on organic gardening, and being more gentle with the soil. And I like the fact of how you've given me that sort of sense of what do you need to do. Stop and think. I'm getting that sense as opposed to just kind of what I call the spray and pray,
Yeah, I use that phrase all the time.
It's such a good phrase because it the one thing that you want to take out takes out so much more as well, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I think, as a gardener myself, I've got a 1/4 acre city plot. So it's quite a challenging on a slope. It's quite a challenging garden to garden, but, we get it producing food and we get it producing flowers. But here we really do stop and think about what we need to do. We make sure we have that big compost heap. We make sure that we manage that compost heap and we use it rather than applying fertilizer. This garden was covered in builder's rubble when I bought the house, and I haven't put a single drop of fertilizer on it. We've used manures and compost that we've created ourselves to fertilise the garden. So it's perfectly possible.
And it's that basically the key behind that to me is patience.
Yeah.
And sort of working with it as well. So, I mean, talking of compost, and I'll just, as a scientist, I'd really love to hear your view on this. It's the 4-letter word, peat. Oh, there's a shudder there. There's a shudder there. But I've got to bring it up because as part of soil management, as gardeners, we know that we have a lot of peat in our products, and I would really love to hear your take on peat.
So for me, I worry about peat because peat is one of the biggest carbon stores on the planet. And when we use peat up, when we destroy the bogs that are producing peat, we are depriving the planet of one of its life support systems. So, people think, oh, well, we could just take a bit of peat from the edge of this bog. As soon as you change the hydrology, how the water flows through that bog, the bog will die. Bogs don't survive just having a bit trimmed off them because everything changes. How the water flows in them changes. The reason that they're there changes. And once they're gone, we are losing one of the most important forces that has helped buffer the climate against the amount of CO2 that we've pumped into it. So my plea is avoid peat at all costs. At the university, we no longer use or import peat products, which has made life a bit more difficult for our research. But we've adapted. We've adapted to that because it's such an important issue. And if I see peat, then I won't buy a product.
Yeah. And it's something that we've brought up on Gardens World programme before. We understand about it, and I think it's just really important to hear the science behind it, because obviously there's this thing where I think people don't understand what peatlands are about. So it's great to hear you explain it, and obviously do want to just think about a plant that's going to grow, because I often think, well, a lot of the plants we're growing you would not find in a peatland.
No, exactly. And you end up having to mess with the pH once you put peat into a soil anyway, and you think it's just not worth it. In Sheffield, where I live, we have a really great municipal green waste source where we can buy composted green waste, and we can use that on our gardens. And if that's what we do, if I need to supplement my own compost heap, then that's what I do.
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the things, isn't it, about being able to get this system going as well within our gardens, and what in terms of urban horticulture, because I know a lot of your work is focused at agriculture and the wider domain, but within the garden, what role can urban horticulture play in helping the wider environment crisis that we're in at the moment?
I think it's critical. So we've lost about a third of all of our agricultural soils over the last 40 years to pollution and degradation. And sadly, I think unless we think seriously about where we grow our plants and why we grow them there, then we're gonna generate a lot of problems when it comes to feeding a population that could hit 10 billion in the not too distant future. So I think for me, it's really important that if we use traditional agricultural methods, big field agriculture, which, let's be honest, is the most efficient way of producing cereals and things like potatoes and carrots, etc. we need to then give that land time to rest and to recover. And we know that in as little as 3 to 5 years, you can recover most of what we call the ecosystem services, the properties, the positive properties of the soil, with a grass clover ley. So giving the land time to rest means we have to grow somewhere else. And I think the urban environment is where we need to grow. So my colleague, Jill Edmondson, and I published a paper a while ago in the journal Nature Food, where we basically looked at the amount of land available to grow in Sheffield. And if we used all of it, there was enough to grow the entire city's 5 a day. In terms of vegetables. And that meant ploughing up every park and every garden. So it's obviously not practical, but it shows you the capacity that the urban environment has to produce food. And we currently have a big project where we're working with lots of farmers, urban and peri-urban and rural. It's part of the UK's Transforming the UK Food System programme, where we're looking at how we can integrate urban horticulture with existing businesses. So using high-tech hydroponics on a dairy farm or in an urban garden, for example. And I think a lot of people used to think this was just kind of messing around the edges, whereas I think this kind of acceptance that urban horticulture has a really big part to play in our food system, I think that's really coming to the fore, and I think if we can achieve that, then we have the opportunity to not destroy our soils in the countryside, and to import some of that food production into cities, which, let's be honest, is where we eat the food. So
Yeah, and it's not going to have all the air miles attached to it. Go out there and pick your own, which is great. And it's really, really good to hear you're so behind urban horticulture, because I think that at times, we could be sitting at home thinking, does our garden really make a difference? Does it really sort of add any value? I like my roses, and to hear you say, yes, it does, is really powerful. Now, the other thing, Duncan, I mean, I've sort of looking at your team and what they do. I've looked on your website, and you're really passionate about science communication. I can tell it talking with you today. But I'd like to talk a bit more about how you express some of that, because it's not conventional, is it? How you communicate some of these things.
Well, I think science can be scary, particularly, hearing a professor like me stood in a lecture theatre telling everybody how the world's about to end. It's not very endearing, and it can be scary, it can be intimidating, and it can be inaccessible. So I work with a very close friend of mine who's quite a famous artist called Anthony Bennett, and we started working together thinking, well, how can we democratize access to information about food and soil? So we started creating artworks together. And I think a lot of sci art happens where a scientist comes along and the artist just creates a literal interpretation of what the scientist's work is about. But we did something a bit different. We've done performance art. We have had sculptures. We've had living sculptures. We've worked with refugees to grow food in mattresses, and seriously, thousands of refugees in Jordan now are growing food in their own little gardens using discarded mattresses, and we brought that into our artwork as well. So I think I've even been on the stage doing performance art as a performance artist, which I 20 years ago, when I was doing my PhD, I would not have believed you that I would be stood on a stage in front of hundreds of people in a giant pink cape doing performance art. But I did. And the feedback's amazing, because I think when people come to our shows, we did a big show called The Sound of Science, which is an electro-pop album for children and adults with a big stage show. We did that at the Cheltenham Science Festival and at the Festival of the Mind in Sheffield. And that was just brilliant. You know, all these kids completely wowed, but the story was one of food security, of planetary health, and of how they need to use their voices to help fix the problem. So it's called The Sound of Science, and it was absolutely brilliant. So yeah, those are the kind of flavour of the things that we do. But I think more people like me just need to get out of our offices, get out there into communities and work with people and you know, learn together about things like the soil. Because, you know, I've learned so much from talking to gardeners and talking to farmers who have this really innate and close relationship with the soil that can teach me plenty about how soils work. So it's a real two-way dialogue when you do that.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely spot on in terms of having a conversation about these topics and learning all from each other. Like you say, you know, gardeners I know have got a huge amount of experience in the spaces that they work on. Their little plot is quite a sanctuary, and I just wonder, you know, we've covered so much, you know, everything from the I'll get this right, the Wood Wide Web and the interhighway we talked about.
Information superhighway, yeah.
Information superhighway with all that mycorrhizae and obviously the importance of keeping carbon in the soil, or, you know, all of these things we've spoken about. What I'd like to ask you is, what one change should we all be making to improve our soil health?
I think it's the thing that we talked about earlier, and I think it's have a think about something before you do it. Don't jump in. Do you need to dig over that bed? Do you need to put down that fertilizer? Do you need to use that herbicide? And in many cases, the answer will be yes. But I bet you, if you really think about it, most of the time you don't need to do it.
Yeah, well, one thing I will certainly be taken away is remember that I can put my ears to the ground and listen to that community of live action that's going on in the soil. So, Duncan, thank you so much. It's been fascinating talking with you. Thank you.
That's my absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to me, Ara Anderson, on the BBC Gardeners World magazine podcast. You can find out more about the themes we've covered today at gardenersworld.com/podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell others about it. Rate us in your podcast provider app. And don't forget to subscribe on Apple, Spotify or Acast to never miss an episode. See you next time.